Attorney Royal Alexander is here, and I made a point of saying a gentleman whose conservative bona fides are across the Arklatex unquestioned. But you have done a little homework, a little research, and let's start with a statement that came from Bossier School Superintendent Scott Smith day before yesterday. Tell everybody what he said, and then we'll go from there.
The long and short of what the superintendent said was that we value our military tradition and heritage here with Barksdale Air Force Base, that we think it's very important for students to stand and recognize the national anthem and the pledge for that matter, but we're talking about the national anthem, and took a very strong statement, which I admire. And I want to say very clearly, I'm proud of my conservative bona fides, and I want everyone to understand that if it were Royal's choice, I absolutely would want students to be required to stand.
See, pardon me, what happened was as sort of collateral, not too strong a word to say, damage of the NFL unity kneelings and taking joining arms, etc. over the last couple of weekends. You knew this was coming. It was going to filter down to high schools across the country. And there have been a couple of schools in the area who have said, specifically Green Oaks, I know, well, that's a Caddo school, and Superintendent Gorey said, hey, look, it is what it is. You guys act on your conscience. Mr. Smith in Bossier said something different. Go ahead.
That's exactly right. The distinction here, Robert, is obviously the NFL is privately owned. Those owners could stop those athletes from kneeling if they wanted to. But let's put the NFL aside. We're focused on a public school, which in the view of the United States Supreme Court is an entirely different entity. It's the government. It's, quote unquote, the long arm of the government saying, we want students to have to stand. We don't want them to be able to kneel. And the U.S. Supreme Court said in a case about 60 years ago that that's forced speech, that if students are not disrupting, not making school difficult, then they can quietly kneel.
In other words, based on Supreme Court precedent, that bluntly put, Mr. Smith was overreaching.
That's exactly right. But I still admire him for doing it. I wish they were required. I think it's healthy for students to stand and show respect to something because it will make an impression on them. Many other people argue against me and say, well, they're learning a lot by knowing they can kneel also. My point is, I'm proud of what the superintendent of Bossier Parish said, and even the Caddo superintendent. The Caddo statement, Robert, was actually more in line with the U.S. Supreme Court.
Tell me about the cases that have led to this without getting into too much detail that will be beyond my ability to comprehend.
There's no area of the First Amendment that's given greater protection than what we call core political speech. Our Supreme Court has always said if there's some sort of harmful or offensive speech, the answer is not to suppress it. The answer is more speech. If someone is saying things that could be construed as racism or hate-filled, let people on the other side come and say, well, that's not, let's talk about Christianity on the other side. Whatever the divide is, the answer is more speech. In our country, we don't suppress speech. But again, schools are an extension of the government. And if the government says, we don't want them to kneel, that's the government in a way censoring, saying, we're going to decide which speech the students can exercise. And the U.S. Supreme Court has said, even at school, you can't force them. That's forced speech to make them. It started out with the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Right.
And they, again, from that scripture, and I should know better which book of the scripture, but it's, we're not going to worship graven images. We're not going to worship anything but God. And when we have to stand and pledge, that case was the Pledge of Allegiance case, when we have to stand and pledge, you're making us praise something we do not believe in. Well, in that case is where it started. That case was over 60 years old, and now it's just being applied to the national anthem.